This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
So who has the most talented rosters in college football? That and more as we continue our preview of the 2019 season next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue and welcome to Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace. It is part 2 of our 2019 college football preview. And we begin by taking a look at the overall personnel for each team in college football who has the most talented rosters in the sport. A couple of years ago, I created what I call my total team talent ratings to measure exactly that. And the reason why is because things like returning starters and other metrics we used to go by, when you see more and more players leaving early, you see more and more sub packages, specialization in college football. Like there's a player at Michigan, Josh Uche, who doesn't really have a position other than in passing situations. Go get the quarterback, and he's really good at it. And this exists all throughout the sport nowadays. It just doesn't measure enough to go by returning starters. Even something like what Bill Connolly has done at SB Nation, which he looks at returning production. That's great too. And I would urge people to look at that data, but it doesn't really tell us how good teams potentially could be. What kind of talent is on hand in order to be developed? So here's how the total team talent ratings work. I take a look at the 24/7 composite recruiting rankings in the last 4 classes for every team in major college football. And the reason I use the 24/7 composite, it's because it's a composite. So it gives me an opportunity to see the average of what ESPN, Rivals, and 24/7 Sports thinks of these players. And then I take a look at attrition, if players have stayed in school, if they haven't, if they've transferred, etc. Every player is then given a point based on the star that they were when they were recruited. Now, if they have played over that star, then they are moved from a 3 to a 4 or a 4 to a 5. And then if players transfer, grad transfers, they're deducted from the total, they've moved to other teams, etc. And this gives me a good idea. Then you have fifth year seniors. Not a lot of programs use fifth-year seniors en masse anymore. That's why I only use the last 4 years and not a 5th year. But if you do have fifth-year seniors that figure prominently in your depth chart, those are included in the totals as well. And then I just keep these updated throughout the offseason. So here are the latest numbers through June 24th. Let's start by looking at the ACC, and I have Notre Dame in here because Notre Dame plays almost half of its schedule, 5 games a year, against the Atlantic Coast Conference. And according to my numbers, Notre Dame actually has the most overall talented roster in the ACC. Some of you may be shocked to see where Clemson is at. Clemson has lost more points to early attrition, something like 40 points when you consider the players that either left early for the NFL draft or ended up transferring. But still, when we get to the top 25, you're still going to see this is one of the more talented rosters in college football. You go to the bottom there, you see Louisville is basically in a total rebuild there with a new coach, Scott Satterfield. You look at North Carolina has a roster somewhere close to the middle of the pack for Mac Brown to be taking over. Dino Babers in Syracuse, their roster total is actually better than the one they had last year when they won 10 games. So you can see that guy did a really good job coaching that team. And then you see Miami with some high-profile transfers. They have a roster that should be able to allow new coach Manny Diaz to be at least respectable in his first year. And then you can look at Florida State's roster, and you can just say there's no excuse for not getting to a bowl game like they did in last year. And that's probably why, if it happens to Willie Taggart again, he's going to be fired. The next league we'll take a look at is the Big 12. Oklahoma comes in with what is clearly the most talented roster in that league, about 9 points ahead of Texas. TCU is a bit of a surprise. They've recruited fairly well for the last few years, and they look to have a roster that should be set up for Gary Patterson to have, one of his bona fide bounce back seasons. He almost always seems to have when the previous one was a disappointment. Baylor and Iowa State and Kansas State have a lot of similarities in terms of the personnel that they are returning. You look at Baylor though, with the job Matt Rule is doing there. Matt Campbell is one of the coaching witches in all of college football right now. Oklahoma State kind of looks like to me like a program that's peaked under Mike Gundy. West Virginia with the new coach there and Neil Brown. Texas Tech with the new coach there as well, coming over from Utah State. And then another new coach, Les Miles, taking over Kansas. I don't think it'll shock anybody when I tell you Kansas, according to my math, has the least talented roster, I should say. If English wasn't my second language, Kansas has the least talented roster in all of college football, at least major college football. And now to the Big Ten, where Ohio State is number one every year that I've done this so far. But this is the closest margin between 1 and 2 that I've had yet. So Michigan has, with 4 full years of top 25 and then 3 top 10 classes, Michigan has definitely closed the gap with Ohio State. Iowa will probably surprise many of you for being number 3, and their total would have been higher. They lost 4 decorated players early to the NFL draft, but that still remains. That's the highest point total a Big Ten West team has gotten in my numbers yet. I mentioned earlier that Clemson had the highest amount of early attrition of any team in major college football. Penn State is number 2. They're well over 30 points of early attrition. Still, they have the 4th most talented roster in the league, but you can see there's some distance between them and Michigan and Ohio State. Right behind them is Michigan State, who seems to be digging out of what was a disastrous 2016 recruiting class. And then you look at Minnesota and Purdue with exciting young coaches there, and PJ Fleck and Jeff Brom. You can see Maryland has recruited fairly well. They've had a couple of top 25 classes there. So we'll find out if their new coach can coach. Scott Frost in Nebraska. What's interesting about their number, of all the teams in major college football, Nebraska's point total comes the most from its youngest 2 classes. So it's like something like 65% of their point total comes from the freshman and sophomore classes. So that looks like a roster that is still a year away. You're basically playing the 2020 Huskers this year. And then you see Wisconsin, which had the most talented team in the Big Ten West a year ago. And now they're kind of floundering in the middle of the pack. It'll be interesting to see how they try to bounce back this year, and maybe with a freshman quarterback in Graham Mertz. And then what can you say about Northwestern? Pat Fitzgerald's a dude. He's one of my man crushes. The guy's just one hell of a football coach. I mean, roster-wise, every year I've done this, they've been in the bottom third of the league, and yet they way overplay their talent each and every single year. That brings us to the next conference we're going to look at, the Pac-12. Oregon. This is the first time a team not called USC has been number one in my total team talent ratings in this league. The Ducks have had 2 fantastic classes in a row under Mario Cristobal, and that has put them, they've surged to the number 1 most talented roster in the conference. But USC still hanging around there at number 2, and that's like Florida State. That's a team that has the talent. They should never be without a bowl game, like ever. Washington is there at number 3 with Chris Peterson. They lose a lot. However, so it also tells you that they've kind of have a consistent program right now, that they're able to reload to some extent. Utah may surprise some of you, being as high as number 4. Some transfers help there. Washington State under Mike Leach, Stanford, Cal, those teams are all really close to each other. UCLA's number has plummeted. And that's because what you've seen there with Chip Kelly is he is absolutely cleaning house. And they're starting over from scratch there in Westwood. And then Arizona State, it was a good thing they got to a bowl game in year 1 under Herm Edwards, because their roster has suffered a lot of graduation and attrition. This looks to be a bit of a down year coming up for the Sun Devils. The final league we're going to take a look at, the Southeastern Conference, the top 2 most talented teams in the country, both out of this league. I don't think that shocks too many people, in Alabama and Georgia. Now, last year, Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State were in a virtual tie for the most talented roster. So you can see that Alabama, particularly with this last class, has put some distance between them and the Dogs. But still, when you have the second most talented roster in the country, that's nothing to sneeze at. LSU, again, that's another, you'll see in a moment, that's a top 10 overall roster. Won't surprise a lot of people. Texas A&M is a program on the come with Jimbo Fisher and the way they're recruiting. You have Auburn, Florida, right on their heels. South Carolina has a top 25 overall roster, but when you look at their schedule, highly unlikely they're going to finish as a top 25 team. Missouri is finding life in the SEC quite nice, thank you very much. They remain a very competitive football program despite the move to the tougher conference. Tennessee's a program that's improving. Ole Miss has lost a lot of talent, but still has recruited very well for the last few years as well. And then Arkansas, a program that has a very proud tradition. Right now, my numbers say this is the least talented roster in the entire Southeastern Conference, a team that does have a very proud tradition. So how do these teams stack up against the rest of college football? Well, if you take a look at their numbers, here are the top 25 most talented teams. Alabama, number 1, like we just said. Georgia, number 2. And then you can see, this kind of fits the MO that there's a couple of programs recruiting better than everybody else. And you can see that in these numbers. Ohio State is number 3, but you can see the gap between Ohio State and the teams behind them is closer than the gap between Ohio State and Georgia. Oklahoma is 4th. Michigan ties with Texas for the 5th most talented roster in the country. There you have LSU, Oregon right on their heels. Notre Dame, Texas A&M, and Auburn round out the top 10. Clemson, think of if they had the guys they lost early where they would be. Even after having the most early attrition of any team in college football, they're still tied for the 12th most talented roster in the sport. That's pretty good. Elsewhere in the Big Ten, you see you see Iowa is 16th, Penn State is 17th, Michigan State tied with Washington for 18th, and then you see Minnesota down there tied for 22nd as well. So that gives you an idea. Who are teams that, if there's injuries, who's got the depth to overcome those injuries? If they lose a key star player from the previous year, or a unit was hit hard by graduation from the previous year, who's got players and talent waiting in the wings to take that next step? Who are the teams most likely to produce the players that, this time last year, almost nobody knew what a Quinnen Williams was? And by the end of the year, he ended up, I think, becoming the number 1 prospect in the 2019 NFL draft, right? So who are the programs most likely to produce players like that? And now, according to my numbers, you got to look at who those teams are. Who's got the highest ceilings for this season? We'll come back. Now, some data points, some trends to know heading into the 2019 season. Some of them are gonna fly right in the face of conventional wisdom. We'll get to those when we come back here on Michigan Podcast. All right, welcome back here to Michigan Podcast as we get set for the season. And at the time we're taping this, we're only about 30 days until Big Ten Media Days, only about 60 days until the first game of the year, Miami and Florida State on August the 24th. It's time to look at some trends to give you an idea of where certain programs are at, where the sport is at, to kind of give you an idea of what could be in the offing for the 2019 season, which is the 150th commemorative year of the greatest game played on earth, college football. Let's begin. Notre Dame is aiming to post double-digit wins for the third consecutive season for the first time in more than a quarter century. The Lou Holtz era, 1991-1993, the last time Notre Dame won double-digit games 3 years in a row. Wow. This is a wow stat, too. After losing 4 games in a season only once between 1969 and 2001, that's incredibly impressive. But Nebraska has now lost 4 games, at least 4 games, for 15 straight seasons. I'm going to be 46 years old. If you would have gone back in time, grabbed me in high school, college, and said, hey, Nebraska is going to lose 4 games or more 15 straight years, I'd have had you drug tested. No way that was going to happen, but it has. Never thought this was going to happen either. If Jim Harbaugh loses to Ohio State this fall, he will be the first coach in Michigan history to start 0-5 against the Buckeyes. Please don't start 0-5 against the Buckeyes. Just don't do that. How bad was Rutgers' offense last year? Well, it was so historically bad last season that its starting quarterback, Arthur Sitkowski, he was the 19th rated passer in the Big Ten. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 14 teams in the Big Ten. Ouch, babe. That's what we call in poker. That's a bad beat right there. The U, another team I would have never guessed this would happen to when I was in high school or college. The Miami Hurricanes haven't posted double-digit wins in consecutive seasons in 15 years. And since they won single-digit games last year, it won't happen in 2019 either. I mean, you could make the case Miami is the team of 3 decades. They're clearly the team of the 80s. Their dominance went well into the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, before Pete Carroll's USC program kind of took over the decade, Miami was the dominant program in the early part of that era. So it's unbelievable they haven't won double-digit games in consecutive years in 15 years at the U. Wow. 7 of the last 10 Heisman Trophy winners were 20-1 odds or worse to win it in the preseason, 20-1 odds or worse. Now, this is totally different from when we were growing up, when schools like Oregon would buy, expensive advertising in Times Square to give Joey Harrington the preseason hype that he needed. Because if you didn't have preseason hype, unless you put up like Barry Sanders type of video game numbers or Andre Ware, you weren't winning the Heisman Trophy back in the day. Now, that's totally changed. By the way, you know who I think is the best Heisman value on the board? You're going to call me a homer. I think it's Shea Patterson. He's anywhere from 25 to 40-1, depending on where you look. But you look at the program he's in, the new offense Michigan's going to, the talent around him, the amount of attention he's going to get. I think he's the best value bet off the board. I'd put Sam Ehlinger at Texas a close second to him as well. Iowa State could be ranked in the preseason AP poll for the first time since 1978. That's when Mork met Mindy. 1978. We didn't know what jump the shark meant. The Fonz was still cool. He hadn't done that. Okay. We were still watching that dude from Welcome Back Kotter dominate Battle of the Network Stars in 1978. 8 was enough in 1978. Should I go on? Disco ruled. All of that happened the last time Iowa State was in the preseason top 25, and it looks like they're going to be when the poll comes out in August. By the way, who remembers the coach of Iowa State in 1978? Former Ohio State Buckeye Earl Bruce was the coach of Iowa State. That was his last year, 1978. He would go take over for Woody Hayes after that. If Central Florida earns a bid to the New Year's Six again this season, they will be the first historically Group of 5 or mid-major program to ever make it to 3 major bowl games in a row. So I know we're tired of their aggressive marketing and their claims of national championships. I get it. But don't let that cause us to forget how tremendous of a program they have been the last couple of years. And now they could be the first mid-major program to make it to 3 major bowl games in a row. Never happened before in college football history. Texas will try to reach double-digit wins in consecutive seasons for the first time in a decade. Those were the Colt McCoy Texas teams, 2008 and 2009. Speaking of the state of Texas, how about this one? I had to research this thrice. I didn't believe it, but it's true. Texas A&M has only had 1 double-digit win season this century. in the last 20 years. And it was in 2012 when Johnny Manziel won the Heisman. Before that, you have to go back to 1998. That was the last time Texas A&M had a double-digit win season. All that money, all that tradition, all that talent, all those facilities. That number right there tells you that's the most underperforming program in college football. Now, I think that's about to change under Jimbo Fisher, which is why they gave him the big money. All right. Oklahoma and Clemson are each trying to become the first power conference teams to win 5 consecutive undisputed, unshared conference titles since Alabama did it under Bear Bryant from 1971 to 1975. And anytime you are in the same breath and compared favorably to the Bear Bryant era, you are in rarefied air indeed. After winning 11 games or more, 5 out of 6 seasons from 2010 to 2015, Stanford has lost 3 or more games 3 of the last 4 years. And the only season that was the exception was the year Christian McCaffrey was proved to us he was not of this earth and should have won the Heisman that season when they won the Rose Bowl. That's the only time when Christian McCaffrey was changing clothes in a telephone booth in the last 4 years that Stanford did not lose 3 games or more. I wonder if that's a program that seems to have peaked under David Shaw. Minnesota, Vanderbilt, and Iowa State enter the season with the longest championship droughts in major college football. A couple of them may think they've got a shot. I mean, Iowa State, a lot of people think is a contender in the Big 12. I think they're good. I don't think they're at the Oklahoma-Texas level. I think Minnesota could be a contender to win the Big 10 West, but those are the longest championship droughts in major college football. Kansas State has a .370 win percentage all-time in games not coached by Bill Snyder, who retired at the end of last season. Here's what that means if you're a Kansas State football fan. Next, Penn State coach James Franklin won 81% of his games in State College the 2 seasons he had Joe Moorhead as his offensive coordinator. He's only won 59% of his games the 3 seasons he has not. So basically, he's Brady Hoke still clapping when he doesn't have Joe Moorhead. That's what that stat tells you. Michigan has finished in the top 3 nationally in total defense all 3 seasons. With Don Brown as defensive coordinator, it'll be fascinating to see if they can make it 4 in a row. They have some key losses, as those of us who are Michigan fans know, but they're also going to a new offense now. They're going to play more snaps with more of an up-tempo, explosive offense. That means the defense is going to be on the field more. So it'll be fascinating to see if they can keep that stat going for a 4th consecutive year. 3 of the last 4 times Iowa has been ranked in the preseason AP poll, it finished the season unranked. So here's what that tells you. There's this notion of Iowa football that when you don't expect them to be good, they are. And when you expect them to be good, they're not. That number kind of tells you that that's not just anecdotal. That's kind of how they roll over there in Iowa City. The past 4 consecutive years, a team ranked 12th or lower in the preseason AP poll made it to the college football playoff. That's happened 4 years in a row. By the way, where was Notre Dame ranked in the preseason AP poll last year? 12th. To make it 4 consecutive years, a team ranked 12th or lower. It was Georgia was ranked 12th or lower in 2017. They almost won the national championship. It's happened 4 years in a row. Wow. Now, 2 of the last 3 years, a team from the Big Ten was the most overrated in the preseason AP poll. In 2016, Michigan State was number 12 and finished 3-9. Last season, Wisconsin was number 4, but only finished 7-5. Interesting. Since losing 5 games total from 2004 to 2006, Auburn has lost 4 games or more 10 of the last 12 years. 6 of those years, the Tigers lost 5 games or more. That's insane for a program with that history, that tradition, those resources. What makes that stat even crazier, by the way, is the 2 exception seasons to that were the year they won the national championship with Cam Newton in 2010, and then the year they almost won the national championship, Gus Malzahn's first year, the last year of the BCS, in 2013. They led that game 28-10 at the half, and then Florida State scored in the final minute to win it. Think about that. They either suck or are mediocre or win the national championship. It's got to put years on your life being an Auburn fan when you see a stat like that. And our final trend to look at for 2019, since we started number 1 versus number 2 championship games with the BCS era in 1998, only 30 of the 84 teams in the preseason AP Top 4 finished there at the end of the regular season. That's 38%. And when you include how many times that's included Alabama, you get down into the high 20s if you take Alabama away. Why does the top 4 matter? Because how many teams do we pick for the playoffs right now? 4. Right? So that tells you right then and there that, yes, there are a few programs recruiting at a level higher than everybody else, but there is still plenty of room for upward mobility in the world of college football. This week's Twitter poll results, we asked you, which national college football pundit do you trust the most for analysis and critical thinking? 50% of you chose Joel Klatt of Fox Sports. Joel does a great job. I'm not surprised. Plus, since he's on the number 1 network for the Big Ten, he tends to give the home teams here the benefit of the doubt. 27% of you like Kirk Herbstreit the most at ESPN. 22% of you, Phil Steele, whose college football magazine is perennially the most popular. And not surprisingly, 1% of you chose Paul Feinbaum. I was actually surprised that it was that high. That brings us to this week's question of the week. Do you think Michigan should change its defensive philosophy? That comes from John. And I would say no. I do think Michigan plays too much man against teams that recruit at or slightly above its level, and that's been proven out. When you look at how Don Brown's defense has performed in some of those games compared to the rest. But here's why I wouldn't change the philosophy. I'd change the offensive philosophy instead. Because what Don Brown's defensive philosophy is doing is it's immunizing Michigan from the kinds of upsets to lesser teams that we used to see even in the Schembechler era, where they'd be number 1 in the country for 5 weeks and then go lose to Minnesota for reasons only Allah knows. Or in the Lloyd Carr era, where he was great against top 10 teams but would hand the ball to Will Carr on the goal line and he'd fumble and Michigan would lose like 9-3 to a terrible Jim Coletto Purdue team. Because what Michigan's doing defensively right now is it's athletically, with Don Brown's scheme, we are athletically overwhelming teams that don't recruit at our level. And we recruit better than about 97% of college football. So the likelihood that a Purdue could out-scheme us on a given day isn't as high as it has been in past eras, because even though Purdue's recruiting is better, we recruit better than Purdue. And so since we play so much your guy can't beat our guy, I think Michigan losing to teams that are beneath them in upsets hasn't been that prevalent in the Harbaugh era. I mean, Michigan's pretty much taken care of business against all the teams it's supposed to beat. It's been those next level teams that have been the issue. So I wouldn't change Don Brown's defensive approach. I'd make it more flexible in certain and more situational, and realize that you're not going to guard 4 Ohio State receivers man to man when 3 of them go to the NFL Combine in a couple of months and run sub 4.4s on a slow track. All right. You're just that there's too much open space. You can't cover all those guys man to man every down. So come up with something flexible in situations. But the overall scheme, I wouldn't change it at all. I think it's helped Michigan maintain a certain level of consistency, beating teams that it out recruits, that even in past eras when we were winning more championships, we struggled to avoid that. But thank you for the question, John. Want to thank all of you as well for watching us with another off-season episode. The off-season almost over. We're almost back to regular order here in just a matter of weeks here on Michigan Podcast. Don't forget, if you subscribe, like us here on iTunes or Google Play, Stitcher, whatever is the podcast platform of your choice. If you wouldn't mind giving us a 5-star review, we would greatly appreciate that. Give us a like and subscribe here on YouTube as well. Want to thank our friends at Detroit Sports Podcasting for helping to spread the word about what we do each episode at Michigan Podcast. And in between episodes, keep up with all of our content at WolverineDigest.com, and you can also follow us at Michigan Podcast. Until the next time we continue our 2019 college football preview, I'm Steve Deace. Go Blue.